What if I told you that Tom Bombadil once walked into the very heart of Sauron's shadow and departed untouched? Hail, friends, and welcome back to these halls of memory, where we wander into the hidden corners of Middle-earth that few eyes have ever truly seen. Today, we turn our gaze upon one of the strangest what-ifs drawn from the cracks and whispers of Tolkien's lore, the secret meeting between Tom Bombadil and Sauron the Necromancer in Dol Guldur. This is not something Tolkien set down in plain words, yet when the scattered hints are gathered, from the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, unfinished tales, and even his private letters, a haunting and wondrous picture begins to emerge. So prepare yourselves, for we now step into a shadowed chapter of Middle-earth in which the most carefree and enigmatic being in all Arda walks, straight into the stronghold of one of its darkest powers. And the strangest part is this: he does not come to fight. It begins in the Fellowship of the Ring, when the hobbits, weary and hunted, find refuge in the house of Tom Bombadil. Frodo offers him the One Ring, and Tom laughs, tosses it into the air, and even makes it vanish for a moment. Not for the space of a single breath does it touch him. He is his own master, Tolkien writes, leaving readers ever since to wonder how such a thing could be. Now imagine that moment rippling outward across Middle-earth until it reaches Sauron himself, still veiled as the necromancer within Dol Guldur. Sauron, the great deceiver, would have been filled with both fury and a deep, uneasy curiosity. Remember that Sauron has ever been obsessed with dominion. In the Silmarillion, as Myron, he longed for order, bending the wild chaos of Arda to his iron will. The One Ring was to be his ultimate instrument of control, yet here was a being who cast it aside as though it were a child's plaything. To Sauron, that was no mere curiosity. It was a threat to his entire vision of the world. Whispers of Bombadil's power would have reached Dol Guldur through many shadowed channels, perhaps through corrupted beasts of the old forest, or through twisted spirits that felt Bombadil's presence like a tremor in the very weave of Arda. Sauron, still hiding from the eyes of the White Council, would not have let such rumors pass unheeded. But why would Tom Bombadil ever choose to walk toward Dol Guldur? Here is the twist. Tom may have sensed the growing rot spreading through Mirkwood, a sickness creeping into the roots of the world, not to challenge it in war, but perhaps to understand it, or simply to remind Sauron that there are powers in Arda that cannot be ruled. Tom cares nothing for dominion, yet he is not blind to its perils, and so, at some unknown hour, Bombadil steps across the threshold of Dol Guldur, smiling, untouched, humming an ancient song, the one creature in Arda to whom the shadow means nothing. For Sauron, this was no mere visit. It was an insult beyond measure, and here the true tension begins. Picture this. Somewhere on the borders of Mirkwood, Radagast the Brown, the most overlooked of the Astari, senses the dark pulse of Dol Guldur growing ever stronger. Unlike Gandalf or Saruman, Radagast heeds the speech of birds, the shifting of roots, and the trembling of beasts in the undergrowth. It is through these signs that he perceives something ancient stirring, and that Tom Bombadil, of all beings, might be the only one able to walk unscathed into the heart of the shadow. Now comes the crucial turn. Radagast was never one for lofty council chambers or great battles. In The Hobbit, Gandalf calls him a master of shapes and changes of hue, and a friend of all beasts and birds. Yet from unfinished tales we know he had already been keeping watch near Dol Guldur on behalf of the White Council. Thus it is entirely plausible that he would turn to Tom, the strange guardian of the old forest, as a last resort, to learn more, or perhaps to carry a message only Tom could bear. Radagast's role is vital, for he stands at the crossing of two worlds, the ordered vigilance of the wise and the wild, unpredictable forces of nature. He alone sees Tom not as a harmless oddity or forgotten relic, but as a possible key. And knowing Tom, the only thing that could move him to leave his own lands would be a sincere and heartfelt plea from the heart of the wild. Imagine Radagast arriving at Tom's house, drenched by rain, his hair tangled with moss and leaves, clutching his staff, speaking in hurried words of the evil festering in the southern reaches of Mirkwood. Tom listens, laughing gently, not from fear of Sauron, but because he hears the land itself crying out in pain. That alone is enough to set his feet upon the long road toward Dol Guldur, humming songs older than the hills themselves. Meanwhile, deep within Dol Guldur, Sauron waits. He may not have expected Tom in particular, yet he senses that something ancient is stirring. Tolkien tells us in the Silmarillion that Sauron's greatest weapons were ever fear and deception. And yet here comes a figure who fears nothing and sees through every veil. One can almost feel the air crackle with tension as Tom crosses the threshold into the necromancer's lair. The meeting is not one of swords or clashing spells. That was never Tom's way. Instead, it is a collision of two opposing philosophies: domination against freedom, control against joy. And it all begins because Radagast understood that sometimes the strangest piece upon the board is the one that truly matters. Here the tale grows even deeper. Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, is no mere fortress of stone and shadow. It is a place steeped in ancient malice. From unfinished tales, we know it served as Sauron's stronghold long before the White Council suspected its true master, and the lands around it had been twisted, poisoned, made cruel. Yet when Tom Bombadil set foot upon its grounds, something deep in the bones of the hills stirred, not in terror, but in faint recognition. Tolkien hints that the very land remembers older songs and older masters. Recall how, in the Fellowship of the Ring, Tom commands Old Man Willow and banishes the Barrow-wight with effortless grace. That is no mere personal power. It is a living bond with the deep magic of Arda itself. As Bombadil drew near to Dol Guldur, the fortress raised upon centuries of fear may have felt cracks forming in its long enchantments. The roots of Mirkwood, long choked and suffocated, might have trembled at the sound of his song. Now picture the spirits dwelling within Dol Guldur. Wraiths, corrupted beasts, lesser spirits bound to Sauron's will. They would have sensed Tom as a disturbance, a ripple moving across a dark and stagnant pool. Some may have fled, unable to endure his presence. Others may have watched in bewildered silence, their dim memories stirred by his voice. This was no ordinary intruder, no elven lord, no wandering wizard. Even the Nazgul, had any been present, would have been deeply unsettled. The ring-wraiths, chained to Sauron's will, feed upon fear, yet Bombadil radiates none. In the Silmarillion, we learn that evil, for all its strength, is ever parasitic upon the good. When confronted with something utterly free and incorruptible, its hold begins to slip. For the first time in many centuries, the defenses of Dol Guldur wavered. Inside his tower, Sauron would have felt that shift at once. In his letters, Tolkien describes Sauron as one who despises the very concept of freedom. And here stood Bombadil, the living embodiment of freedom, walking uninvited and unafraid into his innermost fortress. This was no simple weakening of spells. It was a profound wound to the spirit, a sign that Sauron's dominion had unseen limits. Tom, for his part, likely barely noticed. To him, it was only a tangled, sickly garden he could not fully heal, yet could ease for a moment. That is the quiet beauty of this encounter. The greatest liberating force in Middle-earth arrives without fanfare, shakes the walls of darkness, and simply continues humming his tune. Now the moment grows truly eerie. When Tom Bombadil and Sauron finally stand face to face within the depths of Dol Guldur, they do not hurl threats in the black speech, nor debate in the tongues of the West. They speak in the oldest tongue of all, the language of the Ainur, those who sang the world into existence. From the Silmarillion, we know that before Arda was shaped, there was only the music of the Ainur, a cosmic song that brought forth light, land, sea, and life itself. Sauron, as Myron, had once been part of that music. Bombadil, Tolkien never fully defines what Tom is, yet in his letters he hints that Tom stands for something beyond, the endless struggles of power, perhaps even bound to the earliest days of Arda. Thus, when these two meet, it is not a duel of wizards, but a conversation between beings who both remember the first notes of the world. Imagine that hushed moment in the dark heart of Dol Guldur. Sauron lets fall his countless masks. Tom, for once, sets aside his playful rhymes. What remains is a raw, primal exchange. Words older than Elvish, older than Entish. Words that even the Valar themselves might pause to hear. No spells are cast. No roaring challenges are uttered. Only the heavy silence of two ancient minds weighing one another in the balance. Yet here is the true strangeness. While Sauron is driven by hunger, by the relentless urge to bend the original music to his own will, Bombadil has no such desire. That is what makes their dialogue so unsettling for Sauron. Tom speaks with neither agenda, nor fear, nor any longing for mastery. In a sense, Sauron finds himself arguing against the very embodiment of everything he has sought to crush and control, and it drives him to the edge of madness. Tolkien hints in his letters that evil cannot truly comprehend pure joy or perfect freedom. Sauron cannot fathom a being like Tom who simply is, without craving more. Thus, if this meeting occurred, it was never about bargaining for power. It was Sauron colliding headlong with the limits of his own understanding. Bombadil, for his part, would likely have walked away with the same light step he entered, perhaps still humming a melody even Sauron could no longer quite recall. Yet in that brief exchange, something within Dol Guldur cracked, a quiet reminder that even the darkest fortress stands upon a world that was first born in light and song. Now we come to the emotional heart of the tale. Deep inside Dol Guldur, where the very air is thick with rot and despair, Tom Bombadil, the oldest and freest spirit in Middle-earth, stands before Sauron. He does not challenge him to battle. He does not bind him with spells. He does not even threaten him. Instead, Tom offers Sauron a choice. We know from the Silmarillion that Sauron was not always evil. As Myron, he was once a Maya of Aule, drawn to order and perfection. What drove him to ruin was his surrender to Melkor and his growing obsession with absolute control. Tolkien hints in his letters that even the mightiest of the Ainur once had at least the possibility of repentance. So imagine Tom standing there, smiling softly, extending a hand, not out of naivete, but from a profound understanding of the world's deep brokenness. This offer would not come as a grand speech or sermon. It would be simple, perhaps only a single line. You need not carry the shadow any longer, old one. No demands, no bargains, only an open door. And for the first time in an age, Sauron would feel the full weight of the path he had chosen so long ago. Of course, we know the answer. Consumed by pride and by the vast machinery of his own evil, Sauron would sneer at the offer. Tolkien makes it clear that by the time of The Lord of the Rings, the will to repent had long been burned out of him. Yet that is precisely what makes Bombadil's gesture so powerful. It was never truly about changing Sauron. It was about reminding him, even in his utter darkness, that another road had once existed. Can you imagine Sauron's fury afterward? To be offered mercy, not by a rival, but by one who did not even regard him as an enemy, only as another part of Arda fallen out of tune with the great song. Such mercy cuts deeper than any blade. And Bombadil? He would have departed Dol Guldur without anger, without triumph, only with the same light step and perhaps a touch of quiet sadness. For even the oldest heart knows when a soul has wandered too far to return. Here the ripples spread far beyond Tom and Sauron alone. After that strange and silent meeting, something subtle yet real shifted within Dol Guldur. Remember that the fortress was not built of stone and iron alone. It was wrapped in layers of enchantment, fear, illusion, and shadow, meant to conceal Sauron's true presence from the wise. Yet Tom Bombadil's mere presence, without raising a hand or voice in anger, left its mark. In the Fellowship of the Ring, we see how Bombadil's songs can shatter spells and dissolve dark enchantments, whether it be Old Man Willow or the Barrow Wights. Tom does not attack. His very being causes the shadow to unravel. It is therefore no great stretch to imagine that, simply by walking through Dol Guldur and humming some half-forgotten tune, Bombadil opened tiny fractures in the necromancer's vast web of magic. These fractures would not topple the fortress in a single night. Yet they would leave behind hidden weaknesses, places where Sauron's grasp slipped ever so slightly, where the darkness grew thin at the edges. Perhaps the spiders of Mirkwood grew restless. Perhaps the trees leaned a little more toward the light. Perhaps, just perhaps, Gandalf's later investigations became possible because Bombadil had unknowingly softened the barriers. Inside Dol Guldur, Sauron would have felt it instantly. Tolkien describes Sauron's strength as both physical and spiritual, a mighty will that binds the wills of others. Yet here was a will that could not be bent, a presence that moved through his fortress like a clear stream cutting through ash and ruin. For the first time in centuries, the necromancer understood that his stronghold was not invincible. It is also worth remembering that Tolkien believed evil is ultimately self-defeating. Dol Guldur's enchantments were founded upon fear and domination, forces to which Bombadil was utterly immune. Therefore, even though Tom left without confrontation, his visit planted a quiet seed of decay, a reminder that the fortress stood upon ground that was never truly stable. And Bombadil? He likely never gave it a second thought. To him, it was no more than clearing cobwebs from an old tree, a small kindness, not an act of war. But for Sauron, it was a crack that would slowly widen until the day the White Council came knocking at Dol Guldur's gates. Here is something seldom considered. For all Sauron's power, cunning, and malice, it was not Gandalf, nor Galadriel, nor even Elrond who unsettled him most deeply. It was Tom Bombadil. Why? because Tom could not be predicted, controlled, or tempted. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf tells the council that Tom would be unaffected by the ring, nor would he have any interest in guarding it. That complete independence terrified Sauron in ways no army ever could. Sauron thrives upon corruption. We see it throughout Tolkien's works, whether twisting the kings of Numenor, deceiving the elves, or enslaving the Nine with the rings of power. His every strategy depends upon breaking wills and sowing fear. But Bombadil stands entirely outside that game. He cannot be corrupted because he cares nothing for the stakes. He desires no power, craves no secret knowledge, and feels no need to conquer or protect. That is what makes him so dangerous to Sauron's entire worldview. Imagine Sauron observing Gandalf, Saruman, or Galadriel. He can anticipate their desires, calculate their moves, exploit their weaknesses. But Tom? He is the wild card, the piece that refuses to follow any board. Even the One Ring itself, the very heart of Sauron's power, becomes nothing more than a toy in Bombadil's hands. This realization would have shaken Sauron as few things ever had. Tolkien himself points toward this unease indirectly in his letters. He suggests that the Free Peoples could not simply entrust the ring to Tom, because Sauron would then overwhelm the rest of Middle-earth, leaving Bombadil isolated. Yet beneath those words lies a deeper truth. Even if Sauron conquered all else, he could never conquer Tom. That is the kind of truth that gnaws endlessly at the mind of a Dark Lord. Inside Dol Guldur, Sauron likely wore a mask of cold indifference during the meeting. But beneath it, there must have burned a gnawing dread, the kind that arises when one encounters something that can be neither destroyed nor bent to one's will. And for Sauron, that was a torment far crueler than any open battle. As for Bombadil, he likely saw Sauron merely as another troubled creature, a fallen Maya playing at kingship. No hatred, no fear, only a moment of quiet recognition and a gentle farewell. And that, more than anything, made Sauron's fear all the sharper. Bombadil did not even need to try. Now let us speak of the aftermath. After Tom Bombadil departed Dol Guldur, Sauron did not simply shrug and forget. This encounter forced him to reconsider many things. Tolkien makes it clear throughout the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings that Sauron was a master strategist, ever adapting, ever plotting, running headlong into a being like Bombadil, one who shattered every expectation, would have struck him like a blow to the face. Sauron learned something vital. There exist forces in Middle-earth that cannot be dominated by power alone. Until that point, his plans had rested upon ensnaring minds, corrupting Númenórean kings, binding the Nine, and deceiving the elves with rings. With Bombadil, that path was forever closed. Therefore, Sauron redoubled his efforts upon what he could control: armies, fear, open physical domination. That is why, when he eventually abandoned Dol Guldur and returned to Mordor, his focus shifted entirely toward open war. Tolkien hints at this change of tone during the Council of Elrond. The notion that the enemy was now openly preparing for war marks a clear departure from centuries of secrecy. Could the meeting with Bombadil have helped push Sauron toward this bolder, more desperate path? It is more than possible. After all, when one cannot master the unpredictable, one turns instead to crush everything else. Inside Dol Guldur, Sauron's brooding after Bombadil's visit would have darkened the very air. His servants, the Nazgûl, the dark creatures, would have felt the change. Plans that once relied upon slow deception and hidden corruption now snapped toward invasion, conquest, and brute force. The necromancer was no longer content to lurk only in shadow. It was one of those quiet turning points that quietly reshaped the course of Middle-earth, even though no one else ever knew it had occurred. The free peoples of Middle-earth never heard tale of Bombadil's visit to Dol Guldur, yet they soon felt the great wave of war that came crashing upon them afterward. It is a classic touch of Tolkien. The smallest and quietest encounters often carry the greatest weight in the long unfolding of fate. And as for Bombadil, he simply returned to his forests, to Goldberry, and to his little songs. Yet the ripple of his presence lingered long in Sauron's mind, driving the Dark Lord to prepare for a war that would, in the end, bring about his own downfall. There is one final layer that many overlook. Tom Bombadil does not stand alone. He is part of a pair. Goldberry, the river daughter, is the gentle heart of his world, the balancing force of living nature to his wild and ancient energy. So when Tom stepped into Dol Guldur, it was not only his presence that mattered. Hers traveled with him as well, like a soft whisper upon the wind. In The Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien portrays Goldberry as deeply woven into the land itself, the rain, the rivers, the pulse of growing things. She is no passive figure. She is the living heartbeat of nature. Even if she did not walk physically beside Tom into the fortress, something of her essence surely accompanied him. One can imagine the heavy air inside that dark place shifting ever so slightly, the damp rot lifting, the deathly stillness breaking, as though the fortress itself remembered a time before Sauron's corruption. And that would have mattered greatly in Mirkwood, where all of nature lay under siege. The spiders, the twisted trees, the poisoned roots, all were the fruit of Sauron's spreading influence. With Goldberry's gentle essence brushing against the edges of Dol Guldur, some hidden corner of the forest may have stirred back toward life, if only for a fleeting moment, a small, temporary resistance to the encroaching darkness. Inside Dol Guldur, Sauron would have sensed that too. Not only Bombadil's maddening freedom, but the living force that surrounded him. The part he could neither corrupt nor twist into another weapon. That realization would have sharpened his urgency. He was not merely fighting men and elves. He was attempting to dominate the land itself, and the land was pushing back in ways he had never foreseen. We should not underestimate the deep symbolic power of Goldberry here. Tolkien's world is steeped in the truth that no great evil can ever wholly erase the beauty that came before it. Goldberry's invisible touch upon Dol Guldur was a quiet reminder of that older beauty, a fleeting glimpse of the world as it was meant to be, before Morgoth, before Sauron, before the shadow fell. And as always, Tom and Goldberry needed no proclamations, no armies. Only their quiet presence was enough to crack the very foundations of one of the darkest places in Middle-earth, leaving Sauron rattled and the land just a little less broken. Now comes the final mind-stretching thought. While Bombadil and Sauron crossed paths within Dol Guldur, the Valar, the great powers beyond the world, were almost certainly watching. Tolkien's writings, especially in the Silmarillion and his letters, remind us that the Valar seldom intervene directly in the affairs of Middle-earth. They send the Istari. They shape fates from afar, but they do not descend with armies. Yet this quiet meeting between Bombadil and Sauron would surely have drawn their gaze. Imagine Manwë upon his high throne in Taniquetil, beholding the music of the Ainur still unfolding across the world. Here was Sauron, once Mairon, a fallen Maya now coiled within his own fortress of shadow. And into that lair walks Tom Bombadil, a being so strange that even the Valar do not fully name him, perhaps a spirit of Arda itself, perhaps something older still. This was no ordinary encounter. It was a small but telling crack in the long, slow tale of Middle-earth. Yet true to their nature, the Valar remain silent. That is both their wisdom and their sorrow. In the Silmarillion, we see how their direct interventions often bring unforeseen grief, from the War of Wrath to the exile of the Noldor. By the Third Age, they had largely withdrawn, leaving the fate of Middle-earth in the hands of its own peoples. Still, they would have watched Bombadil's visit, beholding in it both the stubborn persistence of good and the stubborn refusal of evil to turn from its path. For Sauron, the weight of those unseen eyes, even if he could not consciously feel them, would have added to the hidden pressure. Somewhere deep in his corrupted spirit, there may have flickered once more the memory of the Maya he had once been, aware that he was being observed, not only by Bombadil, but by powers far greater still. And yet, as ever, he chose defiance. Bombadil, on the other hand, would have felt none of that weight. He was not acting for the Valar. He was not fulfilling some grand cosmic design. He was simply being himself, free, joyful, untouchable. And that is what makes the moment so beautiful. Even beneath the eyes of the gods, Bombadil remained Bombadil, and Sauron remained Sauron. So when Tom walked out of Dol Guldur, the Valar let him go without a word, trusting in the slow and often painful unfolding of history. And Sauron turned back to his shadows, his fear sharpened, his plans for war hardening. Yet in some buried corner of his being, he now knew that Middle-earth still held powers he would never master. And that is the tale, the secret hypothetical meeting between Tom Bombadil and Sauron at Dol Guldur, woven together from every corner of Tolkien's vast legendarium. If you have journeyed with me this far, I lay this question before you. Do you believe Bombadil could truly have changed Sauron's fate, or was the Dark Lord already too far gone into shadow? And if your heart hungers for more deep journeys into Tolkien's lore, strike the flame of subscription, for we have many more tales yet to tell, from the pages of Unfinished Tales, the history of Middle-earth, and and even the wildest secrets hidden within Tolkien's own letters.